Somewhere in a locked lab right now, there is a 7-foot wooden box that hasn't ticked since before your country existed. And it is screaming. Not metaphorically, not, oh, that's a creepy old clock, screaming. I mean, actual, measurable, recorded on 4-step separate microphones, screaming. No weights, no wind up, no power source of any kind. Just 300 years of eerie silence. And a sound coming out of the gears that sounds exactly like a man trying to breathe through a collapsed lung. I'm going to tell you about a clock that a man's life ended inside of, not next to, not near, inside of. His hand was still in the mechanism when they found him, and for 3 centuries that clock has been doing something that should be flatly, laughably impossible. It's been ticking without ever being wound. Tonight, we're not hunting a ghost in a hallway. We're doing an autopsy on a piece of furniture. Bring a jacket. It gets cold in here. Welcome to the Phantom Navigator. I'm your host, and I did not sleep well putting this one together. So buckle up, because neither will you. Okay, housekeeping, then horror. If you're new here, this is the show where I take something completely mundane, a doll, a mirror, a grandfather clock, apparently, and I dismantle it, literally and figuratively, until I find the exact molecular coordinates where physics gave up and something else clocked in for the night shift. No pun intended. Okay, pun fully intended. I'm not going to lie to you in the first 4 minutes. Tonight's subject, a 17th century long case clock. You call it a grandfather clock. I call it a 7-foot tall wooden coffin that somebody forgot to bury, standing upright in hallways for 300 years, watching you walk past it in your socks at 2 a.m. like it's just furniture. It is not just furniture. It was never just furniture. And tonight, I'm going to prove it to you with acoustic sensors, thermal cameras, and possibly my own cardiovascular system. Because, spoiler, by the end of this episode, my heart rate is going to be doing something a cardiologist would call not ideal. Let's meet the man who built the thing. Quick history lesson, and I promise I'll make it hurt. Before the 1660s, clocks were garbage. I mean that with love and also total confidence. They lost up to 15 minutes a day. 15 minutes! You couldn't trust a clock to tell you what century it was, let alone the hour. Then in 1656, a Dutch physicist named Christian Huygens invented the pendulum clock, and about 15 years later, a guy named Robert Hooke, yes, that Hooke, the one who's discovered cells and also apparently had time to ruin grandfather clocks for the rest of us. co-invents something called the anchor escapement. And suddenly, clocks are accurate to the second. Now, sit with that for one moment, because a 17th century brain, this isn't engineering, this is witchcraft with better PR. For the first time in human history, a box of metal is keeping a promise about the future that hasn't happened yet. People start looking at these towering wooden cabinets because that's what they were built. These massive oak and walnut coffins to protect the long pendulum and the swinging lead weights. And they start feeling like these things aren't furniture, they're company, silent, ticking, watching company that stands in the dark corners of your hallway and counts down something you can't see. Cute, right? Charming, even. That's the fun part about the history lesson. Here's where it stops being charming. Winter, 1689, London. The River Thames froze solid. Like, walk across it, set up a market on the ice, solid. This was the Great Frost, one of the worst cold snaps in English history, and in Cramp's workshop in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, a master horologist named Bartholomew Finch. Life is ending. And instead of doing what literally any reasonable person does when their life is ending, which is, I don't know, resting, seeing a priest, eating soup, Bartholomew Finch decides this is the perfect time to solve the single most arrogant engineering problem a human being can attempt. He wants to build a clock that never needs winding, a mechanical simulation of eternal life. The apprentices in his workshop said he'd stopped praying. He started muttering rhythmic equations to the swinging pendulum instead, like it owed him something, like it was listening. Look, I've had deadlines, I've stayed up too many late finishing projects I probably should have just abandoned. None of us are strangers to unhealthy obsession. But there's, I'll finish this by Friday, and there's, I will defeat death itself using bell metal brass. And Bartholomew Finch picked door number 2 while actively expiring. On the night of the frost finally broke, I want you to imagine the timing on this. The clock seized, a tiny burr on the escape wheel. A piece of grit smaller than a grain of sand jammed the entire mechanism, stopped his masterpiece cold, and Bartholomew, lungs failing, does not sleep. He drags his workbench over the clock, opens the hood, and begins performing surgery on his own life's work with his last functioning breath. The parish watchman's log. This is the real document. This actually exists. Records a sudden, high-pitched metallic shriek coming from Finch's shop at midnight in the dead of a frozen London winter. The next morning, his apprentices find him slumped over the movement. His right hand is frozen inside the gears, fingers locked around the mainspring arbor like he was strangling it. His life ended mid-repair, trying to force the jammed anchor pallets past the teeth of the escape wheel with his bare hand. In the machine, at the exact second his heart stopped. And here's the part that should have ended everyone's night immediately. When the apprentices finally pried his frozen fingers out of the mechanism, the clock didn't go quiet. The mainspring snapped backward, locked the entire gear train onto permanent maximum tension. Like the clock took one look at the unalived man and decided, no, we're not finished here. They boarded it up, put it in a cellar, passed it down through the generations of increasingly nervous collectors for 300 years. And it is sitting on my workbench right now. No, but I actually wish it was. Here's what should be true. According to every law of physics currently taught in every university on Earth, a mechanical clock with no wound spring, no hung weights, and 3 centuries of total inactivity should be silent, dead. A brass paperweight. That's not opinion. That's Newtonian mechanics. That's the kind of thing you'd fail a physics exam for getting wrong. Instead, if you stand next to this thing in a quiet room, you can hear it. A frantic, uneven vibration humming through 300-year-old wood. And underneath that, a weeping, a faint, rhythmic, unmistakably organic weeping coming from the gears that Bartholomew Finch, life ended trying to free. So obviously, the professional move here is to strap contact microphones directly onto a haunted piece of furniture and turn the volume all the way up, which is exactly what we did. Because I have never once in my life made a decision that a sane person would describe as wise. We don't use air microphones for this. Regular mics pick up room echo. My breathing, the ambient hum of every piece of equipment in the lab, whining about being turned on at 1 a.m. We need something that skips the air entirely and listens straight to the skeleton of the thing. So, piezoelectric contact mics clamped directly onto 3 points: the great wheel plate, the center arbor, and the escapement bridge, which, if you're taking notes, is basically clamping a stethoscope directly onto the exposed heart of a man who's been unalived since William III was on the throne. Headphones go on, and the room disappears. What comes through isn't friction. Friction's chaos. It's white noise. It's random. It decays. It gets quieter as energy runs out. The way basically everything in the universe is supposed to behave when nobody's feeding it power. This is not that. Deep in the mainspring barrel, forged during the coldest winter London had seen in a generation, there's a heavy, rhythmic thudding at 4.5 hertz, too low to hear normally, but strong enough to physically vibrate the workbench. It doesn't sound like a machine. It sounds exactly like a man's heartbeat mid cardiac arrest. And then there's the escapement. When we run that signal through a spectrogram, which is just a fancy way of turning sound into picture, normal friction looks like a fuzzy, chaotic mess. This didn't. This produced clean, isolated, harmonic spikes at 880 and 1200 hertz. That's not grinding metal, that's range. 880 to 120 to 1200 hertz is the acoustic signature of the human vocal cord under extreme duress. The gears aren't scraping, they're modulating. Something is using 300 years of rust like a set of vocal cords, and it is not singing show tunes. We hooked up a power meter just to twist the knife a little further into the corpse of classical physics. A dead clock, no power source, should read 0 Newton meters of torque. 0. This one read 0.4. Spontaneous, internal, from absolutely nowhere. The room temperatures at the anchor pallets dropped from a normal 21 degrees Celsius to 14. And it just stayed there. No mechanical explanation on Earth accounts for a machine getting colder the harder it works. Somewhere, Isaac Newton is spinning in his grave at roughly 1200 hertz. I want to pause the horror for a second and explain why we think a piece of furniture can hold a soul hostage. Because I promise you, both dark comedy and legitimate dread, and it's time to deliver the second one with a straight face. There's a concept in fringe physics called the stone tape theory. The name comes from a 1972 BBC television play written by Nigel Neal about a team of engineers who move into an old mansion trying to invent a new recording medium and accidentally discovers the walls already are one. The idea, and it was seriously explored by actual Cambridge researchers, not just TV writers, is that intense emotional trauma can imprint itself onto crystalline structures, stone, quartz, certain metals. The material doesn't just sit there being a wall, it records. Now, a stone wall is passive. It just sits there absorbing whatever trauma happens nearby. Like your coworker who overhears every argument in the break room and never says anything about it. A mainspring is not passive. A mainspring is actively, violently trying to release energy at all times. It's not just a wall soaking something in. It's a coiled springs desperately trying to push something out. Which means, theoretically, if a man's life ends with his hands locked inside a spring under maximum tension, pouring his entire body ending consciousness through his fingers onto the steel at the exact millisecond his heart stops. That steel doesn't just record him, it becomes a cage. There's actual physics backing part of this up, and this is the part that should generally unsettle you. Metals possess something called elastic hysteresis, basically a memory of stress they've been put under. 17th century mainsprings were hand-hammered, wildly inconsistent, full of microscopic flaws. Nothing like the smooth, uniform steel we forge today. Under extreme, prolonged stress, those imperfections lock the atomic structure into place. The metal doesn't relax back to normal. It freezes mid-scream. And because the clock jammed, because the escapement physically could not release, that atomic tension has nowhere to go. No natural decay path, no gradual release into heat or motion, the way normal physics demands. The consciousness, if you want to call it that, is trapped in exactly the same prison as the tension itself. The spring can't relax. The man can't leave. They are, and I want you to really let this word choice land, codependent. Every microburst that trapped tension has bled off somewhere, and the only path available is straight through the gear train into the rusted escapement, converted into sound. You're not hearing a haunted clock. You're hearing a 300-year-old panic attack that has never once been allowed to finish. Alright, theory's done. Time for the part of the show where I do something a licensed conservator would have an aneurysm watching. You cannot just yank this thing apart. 17th century movements are held together by a pillar and pin system. Hand-turned brass pillars locked with tiny tapered iron pins. No screws, nothing modern. If you rip into it wrong, all the invisible trapped torque releases in one violent burst and shatters. 300-year-old gear teeth, or takes off a finger. Possibly mine if I tried. I have grown attached to my fingers, so I'm going to be very careful and definitely never try. Step 1. We clamp a steel restraint directly over the mainspring coils before touching a single pin, because whatever's locked inside that spring cannot be allowed to expand freely. The second that clamp bites down, the contact mic spikes into a deafening burst of white noise. The 4.5 hertz cardiac pulse accelerates. It frightens the restraints like a trapped animal. And I want to be very clear, I did not sign up to restrain an animal tonight, and yet. Step 2. Pulling the pins, 4 of them, non-magnetic brass pliers, because apparently even the tools have to be paranoid. First pin comes out. Puff of 3-century-old rust dust. Like the clock just exhaled. Second pin. The acoustic weeping actually shifts up half an octave. Like it noticed By the time the last pin drops onto the workbench felt, the room temperature has visibly dropped 3 degrees, and my breath is fogging over brass gears that has not needed my breath to fog over them in 300 years. Step 3. Splitting the plates. 2 ivory wedges, millimeter by millimeter, prying the front plate off the arbors. And this is the moment I stopped being able to pretend this was just old engineering, because the gear wheels, which should just sit there, resting, obeying gravity like every other object in the observable universe, starts floating, clinging to the upper plate like they're magnetized. Through the loop, the ancient whale-oiled residue in the pivot holes is glowing with a faint, iridescent friction sheen. Even through the metal is completely bone dry. The arbors are micro-vibrating so fast they blur to the naked eye, with no power source at all. And then we get down to the last 2 components standing: the escape wheel and the anchor. Everything else in the gear train completely dead the second we lift it clear. Just cold brass. But the escape wheel and the anchor keep going, disconnected from every other part of the mechanism, completely isolated and still moving. Under the jeweler's loop, we find it. The exact right pallet of the anchor, fused to the 3rd tooth of the escape wheel by a deep pit of black oxidation. I want you to understand what that means. That's not corrosion. That is the exact geometric coordinate where Bartholomew Finch's heart stopped. His last conscious act at the precise molecular level, welded into the metal like a fingerprint that refuses to fade. The ghost isn't in the clock. The ghost is in one single rusted tooth. Before we break the weld, we try to talk to him, because apparently I've decided that run is not in my vocabulary tonight. We bring in a spirit box, sweeps through radio frequencies at breakneck speed, generating a wall of chopped up static and stray signal. The theory, if you're into instrumental transcommunication, is that an entity can hijack a raw radio noise and shape it into words faster than random chance should allow. We place the antenna against clock's corner pillar and start manually turning one of the intermediate wheels with carbon fiber forceps. Because remember, mechanical motion here seems to be the fuel. And the second gears click. The spirit box chaotic frequency sweep does something it should never, structurally, be able to do. It locks in. Every time a tooth strikes the anchor, clack. The sweep goes dead silent. And in that spilled second of silence, instead of stray commercials or music fragments, the static organizes itself into words. I ask, out loud, into a 300-year-old dead man's escapement. Who is bound to this movement? Static, click, and then, lo, gravelly, unmistakably a 17th century London accent. Finch, click, Bartholomew. I ask why the clock won't fall silent. The teeth, click, they will, click, not pass. The EMF meter spikes 80 milligauss on its own. I ask him, generally, foolishly, like this is a therapy session and not a haunted antique, how we free him. Break, click, the weld, click. Let me out. Okay, cool, great. Normal Tuesday. Just a normal day. Love that for me. Room's near freezing now. Our own breath is coming out in thick white clouds. And then battery indicators on every single recorder in the lab are draining. Being drained. Like something is actively feeding on them. The escapement shriek has climbed to a continuous, unfiltered 1200 hertz wail that doesn't sound like a grinding metal anymore. It sounds like a throat tearing. No metal tools. Anything conductive risks discharging whatever built up here violently straight into my hand, and I would like to keep my hand. So, a non-conductive bone probe slipped into the microscopic gap at the fuse vertex. The wall instantly drops into a low guttural growl. I can feel travel up through the probe, into my wrist, up my arm, straight into my chest. Like the clock just reached out and grabbed something inside me. I twist. The metal fights back, generally fights, bends the probe under a level of resistance that has no mechanical explanation whatsoever. And then, with a sound like a small caliber gunshot in an enclosed room, crack, the weld snaps. And then the room detonates. The escape wheel, freed from the jam that unalived its creator, doesn't just spin. It explodes into motion, thousands of revolutions per minute, a gold blur shredding 300 years of trapped kinetic rage in about 4 seconds flat. The scream spikes into a crescendo that sounds, unmistakably, exactly like a drowning man breaking the surface for one final gasp of air. And then the recorders blow straight into dead silence. The frost on the workbench flash boils into a ring of scream. Room temperature rockets from near freezing back up to stifling in seconds flat, thick with the smell of scorched brass and something that can only be described as ozone with a body count. And through that dissipating steam, I need you to understand I am not exaggerating for contents here. I have this on 4 separate cameras, a pale, human-shaped silhouette hunched over a workbench, head thrown back in one long, silent release. It dissolves into the ceiling. I have interviewed exactly 0 people who have had a more unsettling day than the one I just had. Okay, breathe. I need a second. And honestly, so do you. Here's what should have happened next. According to every ghost story you've ever heard, the shadow dissolves the room. The shadow dissolves, the room warms back up. We all go home, roll credits. Everybody's a little more scared of antiques than they used to be. Clean ending, satisfying arc. Bartholomew Finch, freed after 300 years, goes wherever it is that freed things go. That's not what happened. Because here's a detail I left out on purpose, and I want you to sit with it the way I had to. The shadow figure didn't fade the way residual hauntings are supposed to fade. Slow, gradual, like a radio signal losing strength. It snapped instantly, all at once. Every camera in the room, infrared, thermal, standard, digital, caught the exact same thing at the exact same frame. The silhouette didn't dissolve outward onto the room. It collapsed inward toward a single point, like something got sucked through a hole instead of dispersing into the air. And when the steam cleared, the mechanism was dead in the completely ordinary, boring sense, the way a clock is supposed to be dead. Under the loop, the third tooth, the exact spot of the 300-year weld, was spotless, polished, like it had never been wounded at all. On the backplate, underneath his scratched initials, BF 1689. A hairline fracture had opened straight down the middle of his own signature. Fine. Unsettling, but fine. Case closed. I tell myself, packing up the gear of 4 in the morning like an idiot who has learned absolutely nothing from the last 20 years of horror movies. Then I noticed the case had a basement. Literally, built into the hollow plinth at the very bottom of the clock, under a false floor, sealed shut since the winter of the Great Frost. There's a compartment nobody, not one collector across 3 centuries, had ever found. I get an endoscope and a chisel onto the seam, and the second the floor gives way, a sharp hiss of air escapes. The sound of a room exhaling for the first time in 300 years. And the smell that comes out with it is tallow, sulfur, and old vellum. Inside, two lead-sealed iron vials of something kind of chemically altered mercury. A tarnished brass locket holding a braid of silver hair, inscribed MF 1683, and a stack of stiff vellum pages, dense with gear radio mathematics that slowly, page by page, degrade into frantic, spiraling handwriting. I hold the last page under UV light, and this is where the ground shifts under the entire episode. So I need you to actually pay attention here instead of doing whatever it is you're doing with your hands right now. The escape wheel is not metal, it is flesh. Every swing of the arm shears away one more drop of my spirit, yet the teeth refuse to clear the gate. If she is to wake, the heartbeat must not falter. I have wound my blood into the spring. If the anchors jam, let no man pull my hands away, lest the loop breaks and leaves us both stranded in the dark. If she wakes. If she is to wake. M.F. Margaret Finch, his wife, died of the plague 6 years before he ever built this clock. Bartholomew Finch was not building an eternal machine. He was building a resurrection engine, and he was using his own dying body as the power source to run it. Which means the hymn we just spent the entire evening extracting from 300 years of rusted brass, the voice on the spirit box, the shadow in the steam, the thing that finally whispers, finally, and lets the gears go still, that might not have been the only thing living in that clock. Here's a detail that kept me up since we wrapped this shoot. And I'm not sugarcoating it for you, because that's the deal we made at the top of this episode. Where a locket contains hair, DNA survives. Where DNA survives, under the right conditions, biology gets weird. The kind of weird that has nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with light, quartz, and inheritance. And when I ran a follow-up scan on that locket, alone, at 5 a.m, with everyone else already gone home, the EMF meter sitting completely dormant next to every other piece of dead equipment in that room spiked. Not near that clock. Near the hair. We are not done with the Finch house. Not even close. Because if I'm right about what's exactly preserved in that locket, and I really generally hope I'm not, then Bartholomew Finch didn't just trap himself in that clock for 300 years. He built the whole thing waiting for someone in his bloodline to walk back through that door. Part 2 picks up exactly there. Bring a jacket, it's about to get a lot colder than 14 degrees.